God says, all that we relate to you in the tales of the previous prophets, with it we fortify your heart. The first thing that I'll point out is to ask you a question. What is the heart? What is this instrument? What is this organ? This is a very significant thing for us to reflect on. You will note, if you have ever made a careful reading of the Quran, that the instrument that our colonizers taught us that we use to think, a mind, never occurs once in the text of the Quran. The term that most medieval scholars usually translate as mind from Arabic, aql, intellect, rational faculty, aql never occurs in nominal form in the Quran. Exactly 0 references to the aql in the Quran. The aqla appears as a verb in the Quran, intellection, understanding. But the thing that does the aqla'ing, the thing that does the intellection and the understanding in the Quran is what? The heart. They have hearts, but they do not perceive with them. They have hearts, but they do not reflect with them. They have hearts, but they do not understand with them. So the first question that I'll ask you is, how do you plan to get free? How do you plan to think your liberation when the very organ that you think with was provided to you by your colonizers? Quick, point to your mind. Do it. That's your brain. That is a physical organ inside of your body. The mind is an abstract construct that is fabricated by Greek thought, operationalized by philosophers like Plato and Socrates and Aristotle. Some medieval Muslim scholars come to use it as a term of convenience. It may or may not be a real thing, but the heart for sure is. Because while God makes no mention of the mind in the Quran, he makes 132 mentions of the heart as qalb or qulub, 44 mentions of the sadr or sudur, the breast that holds the heart in, 16 mentions of the fu'ad, the ardent flame of the heart. So I know, because the best anthropologist is the creator of the human being. The best one to make a study of the human being is the one who made the human being. Would he not know, he who created it? So part of the way that we will gain our liberation is by beginning to question the very categories of thought through which we apprehend the world, and cease to think in the terms that our colonizers have taught us to think, and start to reason with the categories that emerge in an organic way from our own tradition, and especially from the Holy Quran. Because you will never get free using your colonizers' tools. The Quran posits 4 basic parts of the human being that exist in a dynamic system. The qalb, which should be the center of the human being. It is not just the site of understanding and intellection, it is also the space of emotion, of spiritual insight. The ruh, the divine breath that God breathed into the frame of our shared ancestor Adam. One of the great West African scholars, Elhadji Martal, led resistance to French occupation of Senegal in the 1850s. Gathered his soldiers and fought against them, but he was a teacher and a scholar first and foremost, had written 99 books by the time he stood in battle against those French occupiers. In one of those books, the Kitab-ul-Rimah, the book of lances of the party of the merciful at the necks of the party of Shaitan, he says that any educated person knows that the arwah, the spirits, are akin in their nature to the angels. Your ruh does not need food. It does not need water. It comes from the spiritual realm. It is nourished through dhikr and through salawat. This is the spiritual center of the human being. The Quran mentions many times our physical body, either as jasad, our physical form, or jism, physical body, as an important part of us. My first book, The Walking Quran, is about how West African scholars have used practices of transmitting education on and through the body. because we learn through mimesis, through being around teachers, not just through our minds and analytical faculties. Our bodies are transformed by these very processes of education. They shape us, so our bodies are important. Never let anyone tell you that your body is insignificant in Islam. Do you have another instrument with which to worship? No. So we've mentioned the heart, which should be at the center of a functioning, thriving human being. The spirit, which comes from the other realm and is a guest in this body during a period of time. This physical body, which though it is low and made of dirt, as I mentioned, is not to be disregarded or dishonored, because God said in the Quran that he made the human being on the best of forms, ahsana taqweem. And in authentic narrations, the Prophet alayhi afdal salatu wassalam said that Adam was made ala suratihi, or ala surah rahman, in the image of the merciful. So while God has no physical body, in some subtle way known only to Allah, our very physical forms are in and of themselves sacred. Do not think of them as insignificant. That's 3 of the 4 significant parts of the human being, and what we will focus on for the last few minutes in spiritual healing and preparation for liberation is the 4th category. If I've mentioned so far the ruh, and I've mentioned so far the qalb, and I've mentioned so far the body, extra credit points, I'm a professor, extra credit points to anybody who can give me the 4th principal part of the human being. I'll wait.
While I grab water.
Who said it? Shout it. The nafs. Good. The nafs. So let's talk about the nafs. The first thing to note about the nafs is that in the Quranic rendering of the human being, it is this and precisely this element of the human being which is judged upon the day of judgment. The soul is that which is judged. The heart is investigated for whether it contains so much as a mustard seed of iman. But if the heart contains so much as a mustard seed of iman, then the soul proceeds on to judgment. So the soul is the part of us, properly speaking, that is going to be judged. We talked last night, and I won't go into details about last night's talk, about the fitra, the sound, innate disposition that a human being is given. And I will just mention that one of the principal things that drew me to Islam as a 15-year-old convert, reading the Quran in translation, was that it didn't have this corrupt notion of original sin. It had an optimistic view of human nature. The human being is sound, and how could the human being be less than sound when the human being is made in the Quran with God's own hand? In Surah Al-Sad, 38th chapter, 75th verse, God crafts the human being with his hand. He breathes into it of his spirit. So of course the human being is sound. Of course the human being is beautiful, and so too our nafs. So too our nafs comes in sound, and it comes in beautiful, because God made it. But the world that we live in is a world where God gave us free will, the capacity to choose him or other than him. And because of that, because of the fact that people choose other than him, evil enters into the world. In its spiritual manifestation, this comes from shaitan and from shayateen, jinn, spiritual beings that have free will, that can choose Allah or other than Allah. And we take spiritual attacks from these beings, but also from the other category of being that has free will, the human being. And human beings choose evil all the time. So from the time that nafs enters into this world, the harm and the evil of other human beings starts to distort its sound, true nature. Starts to produce scar tissue all over your soul. The brutality, the oppression, sometimes the abuse. The way in which people have harmed you with their tongues or with their hands starts to produce patterns of behavior in your nafs, in your soul, that pulls you further and further away from your sound, fitri state, takes you farther and farther away from your inherently divine nature. And this is what oppression does to us as a people. It breaks our souls. It crushes our souls. Oppression is soul crushing. It bruises us. And the path towards internal liberation and external liberation are one. It is a jihad of the soul. This all sounds very speculative, Professor Ware. Give us an example from the Quran. Fine. Surah Kahf. How many of you have paid close attention to the story of Sayyidina Musa and his spiritual guide and mentor, Sayyidina Khidr? Well, this is the archetype for many of the teachers of Sufism for the relationship of a spiritual guide to a spiritual mentee. Some of those teachers will say that the only roles of a spiritual guide are to help a human being get back to their fitrah and then help them establish their relationship with the word of Allah. Put you back in your sound state the way that God made you. Get you back through those things that broke you so that when the word comes down on your heart, it germinates inside you and you go out into the world and do what must be done. All that we relate to you in the tales of the prophets, with it we fortify your heart. We fortify your heart so that you can go out and take up the struggle of your time the way that they took up the struggle of their time. So let's reflect briefly on the instructive examples that Khidr gives to Moses in his teaching because they are profound. So we've got a morning Quran test. What's the first test that Khidr gives to Moses? Speak louder. I got like a heating duct behind me. Huh? He cracks, somebody said patience. No, what does he do? He cracks the boat. He cracks the boat. And he's going to explain eventually, the guide will explain eventually, that that boat belonged to a poor family who earned their income from it, and that there was a tyrant on the other side of the water passing who was confiscating every sound vessel. So Khidr is trying to protect an oppressed person from an oppressor in his cracking of the vessel. He is doing the work of social justice in the world, but he is also providing spiritual guidance to his mentee, to Sayyidina Musa. Why? Because Sayyidina Khidr, alayhi salam, is making Moses confront the sources of his childhood pain and oppression. And until you confront what your oppressors have done to you, then their fist print is inside your very soul, distorting your very nature. Why is this a test that is causing him to confront his childhood trauma? What happened to Moses that included a water trial when he was a baby? He was a baby in a basket, floating down the most powerful river on the face of the earth to the most powerful tyrant on the face of the earth. How much more helpless can a human being be? Carried into the house of those who were oppressing and brutalizing his people through a system, by the way, of apartheid. God names apartheid as a sin in the Quran in Surah Al-Qasas. He says that Pharaoh was amongst the mufsideen, the corruptors, because he split the people into sects, governing some with justice and tormenting others. That's apartheid. So he condemned the Palestinian regime, the Israeli regime against Palestinians. He condemned the apartheid state of South Africa. God condemned the segregationist system that emerged in America. Moses is being caused to confront this source of his childhood pain and his childhood trauma so he can travel back to his fitrah, so he can become who he needs to become to finally lead his people into the promised land. Most of the exegetes of Quran say that this incident with Sayyidina Khidr comes in the time after the emancipation but before arriving at the promised land. There are disputes amongst the Mufassirin about it, but that's the interpretation that I also prefer. The second is much more instructive even than the first. He slays the youth. And Moses, even though he had promised twice now to be patient, must protest because he is deeply triggered by this incident. Why is Moses triggered by this incident? Have you taken an innocent life that has slain none? Why? I'm asking y'all a question. Listen, I told y'all last night, I was raised in an African-American rhetorical tradition that is based on call and response. I'm not going to sit up here and listen to myself talk for 40 minutes. Why? Because he had killed someone. Also mentioned in Surah Qasas as it happens, but not just because Moses had shed blood. Why had Moses shed blood? Moses had shed blood because he was still bearing the trauma of all of the oppression and bloodshed of his people when he was in youth. Have y'all reflected on the case of Sayyidina Musa, alayhi afdal salatu wassalam? Imagine having all of the male children killed in alternating years just so that you would never be born. You think that you are facing trauma? Walk a mile in Moses' sandals. His brethren were killed to keep him from ever coming into being, and he is being raised in Pharaoh's house, eating good while his people are being oppressed. Imagine the guilt, imagine the pain. And all of that comes out in that moment in Surah Qasas, where he sees a conflict between his tribesmen and the tribe of his oppressor. And he leaps to the defense of his tribesmen, not knowing that his tribesman was the one who was in the wrong. And all of that pain, all of that torment comes out of Moses, and in a single blow, he, peace be upon him, slays a man. So Moses is grieving doubly. He is grieving not only of all the blood of his oppressed people that had been spilled, but he is grieving now at the fact that it has turned him into a wrongdoer, and he repents of it immediately. Because this is what happens if you do not heal from the harm that your oppressors have inflicted upon you. You are guaranteed to become an oppressor. You are guaranteed to become a tyrant. The trauma that has been inflicted on you, you will reproduce. So I ask you, Ya Qawmi, O my people, do you want justice? Do you want liberation? Or do you want vengeance? Do you want the Quranically mandated promise of justice and equity for all human beings? Or do you want power for your tribe? Are you grooming yourself for liberation and freedom for humanity on a Quranic model? Or are you going to become Zionist 2.0? I told people for a long time that the thing that I fear most for my people is that we would be given the power over our oppressors that our oppressors had over us before we were first healed of the harm. And I have that same fear. And I was speaking as an African American. I wasn't even Muslim yet at that time. But that's speaking for all of us. Because unless and until we do this inner work of mining the spiritual resources of our tradition to find healing, we will become, because by the way, liberation is promised. The end of every empire is taught by the Quran. This empire will fall. No empire lasts forever. We act like it's going to be difficult. It is not going to be difficult. It is already written. It will require the best in us, but it is going to come. But what will replace it? Because if you want to know what it looks like when a people that have been subjected to racial trauma, systematic oppression, and violence are given power, but they have not yet healed from that which was done to them, ask a Zionist about it. Some of them are coming straight out of concentration camps as prisoners to become concentration camp guards, going from being ethnically cleansed in Warsaw ghettos to ethnically cleansing in the Nakba. And the reason is that they did not utilize the teachings of our sacred tradition, which is their sacred tradition as well. There has only ever been one deen. So are you using the spiritual resources of your tradition to heal? Or will you be so broken that even after freedom is presented to you, that you will wander for 40 years in a desert that takes 2 weeks to cross? Do y'all know what I'm talking about? Bnei Israel wandered for 40 years before they entered the promised land. That's a 2-week walk. But they were a people that were not ready for freedom yet. And are you? Have you convinced yourself that these oppressors are undefeatable and undefeated? Once you're free, will you long for the food of Egypt the way that they longed for the food of their oppressors? Moses, we don't like this manna and quails. We want lentils and onions like we had back at Massa House. Because that's all they were saying. Are you free enough internally to grasp your freedom in the world? I'll close with the final example from Surah Al-Kahf and the teachings between Khidr and Moses. The last of those examples is that Khidr and Moses are denied hospitality by the inhabitants of a township. And being denied hospitality back in that day means you don't have no place to wash up, you don't have anything to eat. You know, like you guys, can stop at a drive-through and get something. If you're denied hospitality in those days, it means you're camping out, trying to start a fire, scrambling to gather something to eat. You might have some, dried smoked fish. By the way, that's the reason for the miracle in Surah Kahf, is that the dried smoked fish that they had been sharing on the journey comes to life and jumps back into the water, and that's when Moses says, go back. That's what we were looking for. You understand why that's the spot that they have to turn around if you understand that the fish comes back to life to jump into the water. But I digress. Treasures of the Quran. Nonetheless, despite them being denied hospitality, Khidr instructs Moses to help him build a wall. And eventually he will say that this is to protect the property of orphans, because again, in every single instance, the teacher is trying to protect a weak one from a strong one. That is the job, okay? When they are finished with the task, Moses says we could have at least asked them for payment. And he's saying they didn't help us, they didn't feed us, they didn't give us shelter, not even fresh water. And we do this service for them. We could at least ask them for payment. And that's when Khidr says, 3 strikes, you're out. You can't study with me anymore. And only then does he explain what was behind it. But what's behind this final lesson? If you are going to go out and to do this work, God's work of liberation in the world, do not expect payment from these people. For your efforts, you will receive nothing but scorn. If you speak out for Palestinian liberation, if you speak out to stop pigs from gunning down my people in the street and for locking us up the same way that they lock up Palestinian kids. And by the way, do not expect us to keep standing for your liberation when you refuse to stand for ours. Do not expect a lifetime supply of goodwill from the black community in fighting against Zionist racism against Palestinians when y'all don't even fight against anti-black racism in your own communities. Y'all better wake up. Expect nothing but scorn if you go out into the world to do God's work. They are going to harass you, they are going to dox you, and you must stand up, you must speak. You do not have the right to be afraid if you have a sound, functioning, thriving heart. Because a sound, functioning, thriving heart is what allows you to have an understanding of where we are in the sacred story and also to have empathy for those who are suffering oppression, and to do what is required both in the inner work and the outer work to stand up, because that is what the Quran is all about. It is the most radical manifesto in the history of humanity. And it is a roadmap to inner liberation and outer liberation, an arrow aimed right at every single unjust oppressor and tyrant, if we would mine its treasures. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.